Hey guys, this is Dale Tedder, and welcome to the Walking Points podcast. And today is our last episode in Ephesians 4, or at least this section. We've been uh, looking at Philippians 4 through chapter 4, verse 9. It's a little section there, but it's a very powerful section, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I've gotten a lot out of it. And again, just as a word of encouragement, I would encourage you to read that section, Philippians 4, beginning with verse 4, and then just, the 5 verses there through verse 9. It won't take a lot of time, and there's a lot there and a lot to meditate on. So I hope you'll do that. Today, I want to start with a question, like we always do. And the question today is, how do we move just simply from knowing the truth to actually living it out or actually putting it into practice? How do we do that in a way that helps bring peace to our lives? Because that's kind of how this all started. But not only peace, but transformation overall. So let me read that again. How do we move simply from knowing the truth to living it out or putting it into practice in a way that helps bring peace into our lives and helps transform our lives? And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to finish up with verse 9 of chapter 4 of Philippians. And verse 9 reads this way. Paul says, "What you have learned and received and heard and seen from me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you." And that's short, so I do want to read that again. "What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you." I think Paul's words here, I love these words because they serve as a great reminder, a very important reminder that Christian wisdom is not just about the attainment of knowledge, okay? We're not all getting ready for the Bible trivia Olympics of life. That's not what it is. Wisdom is applied knowledge. How do we take what we've learned? Because that's very important. But then how do we live it out? How do we put it into practice? And that's what Paul's talking about here. Throughout all of his letters, really, Paul emphasizes that discipleship, following Christ, involves both learning and doing. Learning and doing. And of course, these words echo what we read in the book of James, where James says, "Do not be hearers of the word only, but be doers as well." And Jesus says that as well in his parable on the wise and foolish builder. The wise builder was the person who heard the words of Jesus and put them into practice, whereas the foolish builder was the one who heard the words of Jesus and did not put them into practice. Living out, responding to, putting into practice that which we learn in Scripture, the biblical wisdom that we learn, the truth, the knowledge, the information. It's not just about understanding it. It's not just about having a really impressive intellectual conversation at a coffee shop someplace or doing a Bible trivia contest, but it's about putting these truths into practice. That's what all this is about. So Paul does something which is a brave thing to do. I don't know many people that would, but I think it's an important thing. Paul points to his own life as an example. And he's not doing it because he thinks he's perfect, but he's doing it rather because he's faithfully following Christ. And he mentions something about this in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. He talks about imitate me as I imitate Christ. And I think that's something pretty safe that we ought to all say when we're talking to our children, when we're talking to our spouse, when we're talking to a good friend, a coworker, other members of our church family, whomever it may be. We want to say, hey, follow my lead, imitate my life. But here's the caveat, insofar as I'm following Christ. I won't say I love reading about Christian biography, about the great saints of Christian history. Maybe you do too, you as well. And what I love reading about the good biographies, it gives you a really honest portrait of the person, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what you learn, you can learn just as much by their mistakes and their failures as you can by their faithfulness and successes. So we want to follow them where they were faithful to God, and then we want all their failures to be a cautionary tale in our own lives. And I think all that ought to be implicit, although we may need to explicitly say it to people when we say, hey, do what I'm doing. What you see in my life, put into your life. And then always there's a comma at the end of that. And the comma is followed by, insofar as I am faithfully following Christ. And of course, what that does is it reminds you, I need to be putting this stuff into practice myself. I need to be faithfully following Christ myself. So the truth of the gospel, here's the big idea here. The truth of the gospel is supposed to be, it is meant to be embodied, lived out in our daily actions. It is supposed to shape how we live, how we think, how we speak, how we interact with other people. And so I want you to notice something before we finish up here. There's a really interesting and important progression in this verse. Paul speaks, listen to this. Paul speaks of what the Philippians, because remember, that's who he's writing to, of what they have learned, what they have received, what they have heard, and what they've seen. What they've learned, received, heard, and seen. So learning involves instruction in biblical truth. They went to the Philippian Bible study. They went to worship and they heard the sermon. Maybe they were being catechized one-on-one. Whatever it may have been, there was biblical instruction involved. And then he says, you've received it. And that really implies they took it to heart. They began to apply what they were learning. They were putting it into practice. And then Paul also says they've heard the gospel that was proclaimed. Okay? And you can read Romans 10 to learn more about how important it is to hear the gospel. So the gospel was faithfully proclaimed. They heard it. And then last, he says that they have seen its power lived out in Paul's life. So they learned it, they received it, they heard it proclaimed, and then they saw how it was lived out in the life of the Apostle Paul, and I'm sure other faithful Christians as well. So I think this is really biblical discipleship distilled to its essence here. I think this is the very heart of faithful Christian discipleship. Teaching the truth, modeling the faith, passing it on to others so that they can more faithfully and more fully follow Christ. So this is important. Christianity is not merely or not only an intellectual pursuit. Now, I want to say this. It is at least that. Some people accuse Christians of being anti-intellectual, and that the record does not bear that in the history of the church. Maybe there are some people that you've met that seem to embody anti-intellectual Christianity, but that's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what the lion's share of Christian history reveals. That's certainly not what's built in to the Christian faith, okay? So the intellectual component, learning, studying, cultivating the life of the mind and thinking Christianly, that's very, very important. But it's more than that. It cannot stop there or it ceases to be faithful. So it's not merely intellectual pursuit, but start thinking about it as a way of life. It is a way of life that is built or shaped by Christian wisdom. So what you learn, you begin to put into practice. You start thinking that way. And don't you want to get to a place where you think like that, you live that way reflexively? It just flows naturally into you and then through you into the lives of others. I know that's what I want. So that's really important, and that's the foundation of the lesson. But then Paul does finish up with some very important words that I think offer hope and offer a word of promise. And here's what Paul says. He says, "The God of peace will be with you." So after you do all of this, after you start living this out, after you put it faithfully into practice, the God of peace will be with you. So this peace is not merely a feeling, okay? We've been talking about that. Peace here is not a feeling, but it is the deep, abiding presence of God that comes into your life when you are obediently living out his truth and trusting in him. Just as Jesus promised in John 14, verse 27, he said that my peace is different than the kind of peace that the world gives. Well, in the same way, Paul reassures us that when we walk in God's wisdom, we experience the nearness and the guidance and the presence of God. And when we put into practice what we know, well, then our lives become a testimony to God's truth. People see what all this studying and learning looks like when it's put into practice. What all of this Christian truth that we proclaim to the world is so important. We're telling them, hey, it really does make a difference in how we live, and it can make the same difference in your life as well. So that's what this final verse has to say. There's a lot packed in there, isn't there? So here is the spiritual principle, or the key principle, rather. Spiritual wisdom is not just about knowing, it's about doing. Spiritual wisdom is not just about knowing. Remember, it includes that, but it's not just about knowledge, information. It's not just about knowing, but it's about putting it into practice. It's about doing. So when we live out the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we experience God's peace and we reflect his presence in the world. By the way, you may be able to tell my voice is not quite as strong as those of you who know me know that it is. I don't know if it's the pollen, if it's left over from the flu a couple weeks ago, but it's wreaking havoc. So sorry for the my voice breaking. Sounds like I'm going through puberty again. Sorry about that. Anyway, so here's a reflection question for today. Are you actively practicing what you learned in Christ? Are you actively practicing what you have learned as a disciple of Jesus Christ? Or is there a gap between what you know and how you live? Is there a gap between what you know and how you live your life? And let me tell you, a mentor of mine, I've mentioned this guy a few times. His name is Ken Boa. He's got a great website, YouTube site. You need to check him out. But Ken talks about that integrity gap, that everyone has an integrity gap between what they know and then what they put into practice. And our goal throughout our life is to make that a smaller, decreasing that gap between what we know and how we live. We want there to be almost no difference. What we know, we always want to be putting into practice. So you could ask the question I asked a different way. How large is the gap between what you know and how you're living your life? Are you actively putting it into practice? Or are you just accumulating a lot of knowledge like you're going to win a prize at the end or something? We need to be putting it into practice. So here's the question. How can you take intentional steps to embody the wisdom of God into your daily life? So here's an action step. Identify one of these biblical truths that we've been talking about. One of these things that you've learned and you know it, but you still find yourself consistently struggling to live out. I mean, you know what you ought to be doing. You know it. And yet you still find yourself struggling to put it into practice. What is that? Identify one of those areas and then begin to really ask God for his strength, for his conviction, for his encouragement, for his wisdom, all that you will need to help you put it into practice. And then get a good Christian friend, get a Christian mentor, get an encouragement and accountability partner, and give them permission to ask you the hard questions like, how's it going? Are you beginning to put these things into practice? Or how can I pray for you? Or can I give you any counsel for what's worked in my life for doing this? And maybe it'll work in your life. But don't try to do it. Don't try to do it alone. Certainly don't try to do it in your own strength. Use the power of God. Call on the power of God. He wants you to succeed. He wants your life to be a faithful witness to your relationship with him. He wants your life to flourish. So he will give you all the resources that you need, but you have to want them. You have to access them. You have to put them into practice. So start praying for those things, and then start using others in your life to help you live out the life that God has called you to live. So that's the lesson for today. I hope that was helpful. Hope it offered a little hope. Thanks for being with me as we've gone through this selection of Philippians 4, and I look forward to being with you next time.